Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. We are all saddened by the reports of heavy fighting in Ukraine, and as our speaker yesterday said, it is likely to get even bloodier and even uglier in the days and weeks to come. The war in Ukraine has had a significant impact on German foreign and defense policy, as we've seen over the course of the past week. Last week, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halted Nord Stream 2, probably for good. On Saturday, the German government announced that it would send arms to Ukraine. And on Sunday, Chancellor Olaf Scholz outlined a new blueprint for German foreign policy at a special session of the Bundestag. In a major shift, he committed to delivering weapons to Ukraine, increasing Germany's defense spending, and also reducing Germany's dependence on Russian oil and gas. Today, I'm pleased to welcome journalist and political scientist Klaus-Dieter Frankenberger to help us understand what this policy shift means. He is the former foreign editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Klaus, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm glad to be with you.
It is great to see you virtually, and I hope that in the not too distant future, we have the opportunity to see each other in person, as we did regularly in those pre-pandemic days. But I am really delighted to talk with you today about Chancellor Scholz's speech and the major policy shift that we can see in what Olaf Scholz said. So let's sort of start by kind of setting the stage. As you think about the speech, what stood out for you?
Again, Steve, and to the listeners and viewers across the pond, I'm glad to be with you. It's a great opportunity to reconnect for quite some time. Excuse my voice, but I'm still in the final stretches of another COVID infection. But you know, you have grandchildren in the kindergarten, and that's the consequence of it.
Par for the course.
I was struck, first of all, by the comprehensiveness of the approach. It's not just energy, or it's not just defense, or it's not just arms, or it's not just a strong reaffirmation of the commitment towards NATO obligations, but it's all of this together, as if the Scholz administration, the Ampel coalition, was writing a new book for Germany, Germany's role in Europe and Germany's role in the wider world. And by the way, folks, are after Vladimir Putin has started his war against the Ukraine, we have a rendezvous with reality, and we see a couple of things now different from our predecessors. This probably struck me most. It's the content, it's the rhetoric. This was a very sober moment. It was a historic moment, or a Sunday session, a special session on a Sunday addressing war in Europe. So it couldn't be just, we make an announcement that we try again and we'll try in the future to reach the NATO 2% goal. No, this was all fundamental. It's a major shift, as you suggested. It's eine Zeitenwende, as it's been phrased here. It's a turning point in how we see the world, how we see Germany relating to Russia, and it affects all dimensions of foreign and security policy and our economic relationship with Russia. It has been a day of reckoning with predecessors, both from the CDU, but also from previous social democratic governments. It's a break. It's not a clean break. It can't be otherwise, but it's a fundamental. It is a fundamental break with years of are trying to be nice to Mr. Putin, trying to understand his grievances, to speak of grievances, to legitimize his behavior, to legitimize how we do business and politics with Russia, with the Russia of Vladimir Putin. And this has all come now to a grinding end. And the speech was probably one of the most important speeches in last decades. The whole reason for it is of unbelievable consequence. We haven't seen this for decades in Europe. There are the brutal redefining of frontiers and the recreation of a neo-imperial greater Russia. And this, of course, needs a strong response. And I would say the chancellor, with the support of the SPD, the Greens, and the Liberals, has given this good speech, it's great speech, and we are at a turning point in our history towards the East.
So in many ways, this war in Ukraine and Russia's clear aggression has served as a catalyst for the speech, but also for this turning point. And I thought it was very interesting to listen to you just now, because it was clear that the speech was not just about Russia and not just about the war in Ukraine, but really has to do with a fundamental shift in German foreign policy and a far more holistic approach. And so I'd be really curious to hear from you how you see that holistic approach unfolding, because basically what we're dealing with is two things. We're dealing with the urgency of the current conflict and images that we're seeing coming from Ukraine that we never thought we would see coming from Central Europe or from the European continent again. But we were also thinking about the longer term. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about this holistic approach and how you see that shaping up.
Yeah, one might say that some of the changes announced by the chancellor, you could see coming. They were in the making. I mean, eventually, since his visit in Washington with President Biden, it was clear that Nord Stream 2 was to become history sooner than later. It has been clear that we have to do something about defense. It had been clear that we were part of for us, for Germany, being economically so much exposed, would be part of a stringent or sanctions regime. It was clear to me that we eventually have to get rid of some of the controversial issues that are a burden in the alliance, that are complicating relationships with our allies and friends, both in the EU and in NATO, that we had to get rid of this. And we also have to look to the wider world. What do I mean by that? First of all, our NATO defense spending. I mean, it has been a controversial issue ever since Germany has agreed upon, but never was willing to really live up to the commitment reached in Wales. Yes, we have increased defense spending recently, and for German circumstances, without the onslaught in the East, rather remarkable so. But now Scholz says, we will spend 2% starting now, and we spend even more than 2%. This is very much welcome by ourselves, for those who care for the security of Germany and the security of Europe, but also for our partners and friends, both in NATO and in Europe. It is clear that we have to do something about our energy dependence on Russia. Oil, gas, and coal, all the three, oil, gas, and coal. And we were telling ourselves we have to do something about our energy dependency on Russia, a state who has cold-bloodedly, annexed the Crimea, went into the Donbass, looked for war in the Caucasus against Georgia and the rest. Now, yes, we're going to do something about it. He accelerates the timetable to become carbon neutral from 2045 to 2035. This will all be difficult. And by the way, we're going to build 2 LNG terminals now. We start now, and we get rid of all the bureaucratic process. That's why what I meant earlier when I spoke about a comprehensive approach to this new reality of war in Eastern Europe. And a third thing is, of course, we look at our whole economic position in the wider world. And this, of course, affects the rivalry with China. We have been linking our economic prosperity, as Thomas Leinebrocker wrote in his book so eloquently, with the decisions of a communist dictatorship. This is obscene. This is absurd. So we have to do something about it. And looking at some of the economic fallouts, the most recent fallout is, well, the business community probably listens to this. We have overexposed ourselves. Probably we will reduce, no decoupling, but we will reduce our exposure in sensitive areas. This is more holistic. And the Chancellor also has rightly acknowledged the role Germany plays in Europe. Now, under the Merkel government, under previous Merkel governments, one of her mantras was, it is Germany's responsibility to keep Europe together. That's what's good. Good point. That's our responsibility. But the times have gotten rough. And just by talking nice to the bad guys won't help us, preserving the status quo, preserving the coherence of the EU, and so forth. And we have to live up now to this reality and the obligations and the responsibility this brings for us. This is a major turning point for the country. It is probably of a nature of 1989, 1990. Along that line, it's more fundamental than when Germany decided to enter the Yugoslavia wars. It's more fundamental than when the previous governments decided to engage militarily, intervene militarily in Afghanistan, and it's of course much more fundamental than when the Merkel government decided to send a couple of or small arms to the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, in a conflict zone, by the way. This is here difficult because it's Russia, it's at the heart of Europe, so the eastern part of the heart of Europe, and we have to acknowledge our responsibility. And this is there for the long term. This is not just a one-off situation with Russia pulling back eventually, or not pulling back eventually. We don't know that yet.
So it's interesting because as somebody who follows German politics very closely, as you do, as this coalition government was forming, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that the Greens would be more hawkish on Russia and on China in their role in government than the previous government had been. And so here we have an incident in Ukraine that has forced the Social Democratic Chancellor to take a harder line on Russia. And it's important to then also look at how this affects Germany's relations with China, because I think in many senses, for all of us that are following this, we don't know to what degree Ukraine could serve as a precedent for a Chinese attack on Taiwan, for example. And so it would be really interesting to hear from you how you see this dynamic playing out. I mean, you started to talk a little bit about China and Germany's relationship with China, but is that something that you think is also central to what Scholz was talking about?
It was not. Yes and no. It was, of course, not central, because central was Russia and the aggression and the war and what is now our immediate response, but it has wider implications. And the implications are geopolitical. Germany is becoming more geopolitical, thanks God, eventually. And it has our economic trade and otherwise implications. Mm-hmm. But let me say a word, because you started with saying the Greens were a little bit more hawkish. This is true. Rhetorically, yes, both vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis China are human rights, are democracy, oppression, or persecution of opposition figures, and so forth. Yes, but it's also being clear that the fundamentals of policy vis-a-vis China and Russia, and by the way, vis-a-vis the United States, have not been made and will not be made in the Foreign Office. This is the prerogative of the Chancellor. It's been this way under Angela Merkel, but it's certainly in this case. What is striking, what I find remarkable in these past few days, since the weekend, how much each of the Ampelparteien really had been whipped in line. Let's start with the Greens. Green, pacifist party, anti-arms party, not irresponsibly so, but it has a history. The group has a history. Now we start to deliver arms to the Ukraine into a conflict zone, in a war zone, and we will see defense spending rise dramatically for German circumstances, rise dramatically over years to come. FDP, more realistically, but still, when it comes to public finances, stringent, don't spend too much. And with this new fund of 100 billion euros will be, put in place like this, the Liberals agreed, the Free Democrats. Probably more complicated and more delicate it was with Scholz's own group. There is this group, this not so small group of Russia friends, Russland Versteher, those who advocate strong ties with Russia in state parliaments, but also in the group in the Bundestag, dialogue over confrontation. You can't hear it anymore. And probably what brought Scholz to the point of almost breaking with the defense secretary, his new defense secretary, this embarrassing, ridiculous offer we sent the Ukraine, which was then about to enter into a war, 5,000 helmets. It made the country into a laughingstock of in NATO, and totally embarrassing, totally ridiculous, and I would say almost and totally irresponsible. And he has taken care of this. You don't hear any word more about Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 might be history, might be over. At the moment, you don't hear a word of dissent from the governing parties, and also from the SPD rank and files, or saber rattling, or howl of war, and all the rest. Things we heard from top SPD people 2015, 2016, 2017, all are quiet now. All are quiet now on the SPD front. And this year is done like this. It's not thanks to Mr. Putin, but Putin's war is a game changer. Mm-hmm. Intra-party, amongst the party, and for public policy in Germany. And the wider frame is, of course, this rivalry with the autocracies in general, and the major autocracy, which challenges the West on a lot of dimensions, on a lot of fields, is China.
So I also thought it was very interesting in the speech, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, how strong a commitment Olaf Scholz was making both to Europe, but also to the transatlantic alliance. And I have a couple of questions from people who are very curious about this German-American aspect. There is one viewer who submitted a question which reads, how much do you think the Trump administration's lack of support for NATO and the inconsistency of US foreign policy, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, affected the current Zeitenwende? I would add to that, to what degree a perceived weakness of the Biden administration, particularly following the Afghan withdrawal, might have contributed to the timing of this. But another viewer also says, did we need a new start with a new government in Berlin and a relatively new government in Washington in order for Germany to move in this direction? Or did we really need this external catalyst of war on the European continent?
Very good questions. Let me start with the last one. I would think, yes, we needed this, in your your word catalyst, I would say the game changer. This is so unprecedented that we see an arms buildup for months and months, weeks and weeks in the making, and eventually, and we see diplomatic efforts to prevent war, prevent our infiltration, prevent intervention. We have our German government officials, French government officials, and the rest been lied at in their face. Obviously, for the German foreign minister, this was also a very mind-sobering experience. Though there were efforts made, no, it's the monstrosity of the event itself, this which has changed the thinking of government officials, which has changed the thinking of also many in the public. Don't forget, there were mass demonstrations in Berlin, in Cologne, Mardi Gras Monday, 250,000. We have a great number of support and sympathy for the Ukraine among people who probably didn't pay too much attention to the conflict 3-4 months before, but have seen now that a reckless, ruthless aggressor is building up tank brigade after tank brigade, bringing it to the border, or setting the stage for aggression, a military aggression, and we see it also on television. This is here in Europe. This is not somewhere else. This is here, and it has come with an announcement. And if this doesn't change the way we go about business, we go about our foreign policy, if this is not a moment where we really revisit our assumptions, belief systems, our principles in dealing with Russia, and in going about our own defense and security policy, I don't know what. Would have the Merkel government behaved differently? Some thought, well, Putin chose this moment very well, a new German government untested, Biden in a delicate situation, bad numbers in the polls, or strong, fierce opposition, Macron in the midst of a re-election campaign and challenged by a couple of our opponents. Europe, as usual, had its handful with itself and the rest. No, it brought the West together. It has brought Europe together, and it has, in our case, in the country we speak about, has brought a major change. I mean, if this was the test for the government, the new Scholz-led government, so far has not failed it. Could have had handled it differently a couple of weeks ago. Yes, sure. Obviously, it needed this frontal attack on the security order in Europe and this blatant violation of international law.
Klaus, you started to talk about this a little bit, but one of the things that I'm curious about is how hard a sell this will be in Germany, both within the political elite, but also to the public. You talked about a tremendous amount of unity, both within the governing coalition, but also with the Christian Democrats. And yet, as Olaf Scholz was speaking at the special session, there was also some booing at some of the points that he was making. But also equally important is sort of how is this playing out with the public? There was a Forza study that was conducted on Monday and released on Tuesday, where 78% of those polled said that they were supportive of military spending for the Bundeswehr, and only 16% did not think it was a good idea. I think in the same poll or in another poll, some 2/3 of the German public is very concerned about the prospect of war. So undoubtedly, these issues are motivating the public. But thinking about Germany's more pacifist history and background, how difficult do you think it will be for Olaf Scholz to really make the case to the German people that this is the path forward?
Well, in the Bundestag, he has something of an all-party consensus, are supporting his position, with two exception. The hard right AfD is against his anti-Russian course, and parts of the left is against. Part of the hard left, some have admitted, well, we were wrong and we need to now really confront Vladimir Putin. Others say, no, yes, it's maybe true, we have to confront Vladimir Putin, but the amount now that is supposed to go into military spending is way beyond reasonable. But I would say 4/5 of the Bundestag are all supporting his course, particularly CDU, CSU. The public is exactly as you have described it. Great sympathy for the Ukraine, and we are terrified to see housing areas bombed and shelled and the rest, and we are terrified, and people are terrified to hear what comes out of Russia. The narrative is disgusting. But of course, nobody wants a war with Russia. I mean, that is clear. I'm sorry that I smile, but that's to say the obvious. Having said this, I would think more and sustained defense spending and finances for the Bundeswehr is supported by a majority. It is because the state of the Bundeswehr has become, in the eyes of many, something of a national disgrace. I mean, Scholz said it the other day, planes should fly, ships should take to the sea, and army troops should have their weapons and gear ready. Now this is we send small contingents to the Baltics, and they have to get their stuff from somewhere. We have to borrow the tanks now from Slovakia or other places. This is unbelievable. As I said, defense spending has been on the increase since, I would say, 2015. But the whole situation is terrible. It's bleak. The other day, someone from senior military leadership said it. We are blank. We are naked. And this is, as I said, it's a national disgrace. It's a national disgrace. It's not just a laughingstock. It's a disgrace, and it is something which is not good for the security of Germany. It's not good for the security of Europe. It's not good for the security of NATO in general, and it's of course not good to advance our interest here and in the wider world. And this eventually needed to be corrected. And I would think the public, by and large, or a majority of the public, supports this. We need a robust military force to protect our values and interests, and those on the values and interests of our partners and close friends here and across the pond and elsewhere. But this is not the case at the moment. That's why I would not think it's a task that's beyond reachable. It can be reached. Make your case, say it, and look at, people just have to look at television at 8 o'clock, primetime television, as we always still do, and here you see the reality, and our reality in the barracks from north to south is a different one.
So Klaus, thank you for that, because I wanted, as a follow-up to that, to ask whether the German public is really ready for these consequences. I mean, obviously, German citizens, German companies have seen rising energy prices in recent months, and that is bound to get worse. So people will feel this in their pocketbook. One of our viewers wants to ask a related question that has to do with sanctions. She writes, Germany has probably the most exposure to the Russian economy, not only big companies, but also the Mittelstand. What will be the impact of these sanctions, and are these companies ready to absorb the impact of such a rapid decoupling?
Well, we see already an exodus of German companies, not just big American multinational companies, but also big German companies or medium and small-sized companies, and they all will affect it. They have been affected by previously imposed sanctions, or companies or small farmers that exported produce to Russia, exported fruits to Russia, and they complained with their local representative. Or people told me, why do we do this? You hurt us more. But the situation is now so dramatic, and the stakes are so high, that are grudgingly people accept it. I haven't heard from the Ostausschuss, the East, the business community, which particular interested in doing business with Eastern Europe, but also in particular with Russia. Ostausschuss, the Wirtschaft, we had been saying early last week, no, we shouldn't impose sanctions, certainly no crippling sanctions. We should pursue the avenue of dialogue. We should be a bridge. This standard rhetoric we have been hearing for years and years and years. You haven't heard anything from them, and I think they have heard the shot. They have heard the shot that the Putin regime are increasingly totalitarian, dictatorial within and aggressive without, is not your typical business partner you rely on, you can do business with. So this group is ready. Yes, the public knows if and when our energy supplies will be boycotted, will stop, will be blocked. This has an impact, has a price, but I would say the government has been preparing the public for this, and we will not see mass demonstrations. The AfD had tried to stoke some resentment already. You just are concerned with the Ukrainians. You should be concerned with German taxpayers who cannot pay the bills at the end of the month. Hasn't had any effect so far, but then one has to acknowledge we are just day 6. Is it day 6 or day 7 in this war? We may be in for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. I have a few viewer questions that take a somewhat broader perspective, but tie in here too. One of our viewers is very curious with this sort of new focus on defense and on the potential military buildup of Germany. Might Germany be seen as being too strong in Europe, or do you think its place in a strengthened NATO and a strengthened European Union will be seen as appropriate or commensurate with its size and economic power?
Yeah. This is a theme that had been a couple of years ago being propagated by our colleague and friend Sigmar Gabriel, who said, well, a Germany that becomes too strong militarily might eventually frighten our neighbors. I have never believed that. I have thought this a ridiculous proposition, to be very open and very very frank with you and our viewers and listeners. We have a long way to go before this might happen. I just learned that our current troop strength is 190 something. Our required level is 210. We need just 20,000 more. We have to overcome the weaknesses of Afghanistan and Mali and the Mali intervention force. We have fundamentally redesigned our military. This will take a long time to work, to be implemented, or at least quite some time. And I have not heard publicly, openly, from partners in the East and partners in the West that they're afraid of a neo-militarist Germany. They've always complained about a Germany that is boxing below its weight level, that is not its military strength is not commensurate with its economic clout and influence and stature. But Steve, let me say one thing. Going back to your previous questions about the public. And this is fundamental, and that's why I also come to the conclusion that the Scholz speech at this historical moment in the Reichstag in Berlin was such a crucial one. Yes, we have part of the public that believes in the big Switzerland. No, big Switzerland. Don't get too much involved. Should go do business with the wider world, but should not engage in conflicts or not militarily, and shouldn't be too close with the United States, but should be somewhere in between. Big Switzerland, neutral. Well, even the Swiss have to give up their illusion of neutrality at some point, I would say. This is an opinion held by some of the public. Has been popular on the fringes, right and left, but also some elements in the middle find it are convincing. I haven't heard anything of this over the past few weeks. Certainly not over the past few days. I don't think so. That this will really, at the moment, capture the mood and the sentiment of the majority of the public. But is something, because that's what the background of your question, can the chancellor persuade the public to go along and to support increased spending and the whole rest? Basically what you say is, if the public prepared to assume a greater burden in Europe, in NATO, in the transatlantic relationship. And I would say, having said and looked at all the aspects, weighing the pros and cons, I would say the public is eventually prepared to do so. Are reasonable, within reasonable limits. But again, this game-changing event is so stark, is so brutal, that people cannot think we continue with just some marginal adaptations and adjustment at the margin. This will not work.
So related to your comments about the sort of public, but also your comments about the German military buildup, one of our viewers has a follow-up question, which reads: do you think that the increased appetite for a stronger German military would decrease the likelihood that a European army, an EU military force, would or could form in the years ahead?
When it comes to Europe, I'm a strong European, but I also hope to be realistic. I've never been an advocate of a European army. I don't see it at the horizon. I don't see it in France. There's no support in France for this, which would be important. I don't see it in other major countries. Whenever what we can bring together to the table in terms of military capabilities and agility and all the rest, this is important for something that we can do together as Europeans, either as Europeans within the EU or as the European coalition in NATO. I'm not our theologian on this one. I'm not dogmatic on this one. We should do what is pragmatically necessary, what is feasible and achievable over time, and not build cathedrals of ideas that a European army. This will not allow us to do anything in this moment and in the crisis we foresee in the years to come.
I guess in view of that notion of being pragmatic, right? I mean, there is the question of military capability, but there's also the question of compatibility, right? Being able to have European forces, even if they're national forces, that are compatible with each other.
I found it interesting what the German Defense Minister Lambrecht said, who is totally new to this business, to this part of the body politic. She had been the Justice Minister for quite some time, wanted to bail out of the Bundestag. Then, with better poll numbers for the SPD, thought she had a second life in the new Bundestag, and she has. And she said, we shouldn't, fancy about building up something by ourselves. Next time we just buy it from the shelf. Buy it from the shelf means we're in the United States when we need an aircraft. when we need a air transport. Or the Airbus is a wonderful transport vehicle, but it was late. How many years? 8 or 10, and then it didn't work here and didn't work there, and so forth. Next time we built the Globemaster or whatever you have on the shelf and it's been working. I found this a very pragmatic approach. Now, the German defense industry will be doing good now, or it's a big challenge for them. But as I said, pragmatic, and what adds value to the buck, as you would probably say. This is the thing what I would recommend to pursue, not building cathedrals in the air, which may get us somewhere or may not get us somewhere.
So, Klaus, as we start to wrap up, I have two viewer questions I'd like to share with you, and then come to a close. And the first one is one that we talked about briefly before we went live. We talked a little bit about this request by the Ukraine to join the EU, and our viewer writes, let's assume that actual membership is not possible without a real accession process. Do you think granting a membership perspective is a possibility? And how have President Zielinski's comments been viewed in Germany?
Well, they were seen mostly as a desperate cry for help and solidarity. And it was also seen as a very emotional and touching, appeal. We want to be with you. We want to be with the democracies of the world, the democracies of Europe. We want to be are subjected by the Russia of Vladimir Putin and treated as a second-rate colony. The accession process is a complicated thing, and I know, or I think I know why the senior leadership is not too enthusiastic about it. Will take a while. You will not include a country that is worn, conflict-ridden, divided, conflict-ridden, and the rest. What I find more problematic is the question that some have advanced, or the idea that some have advanced, well, forget about NATO and bring the Ukraine into the EU. Eventually Vladimir Putin might agree to this. I strongly disagree. The EU may be at some point even more important to in the eye of Vladimir Putin, because the EU stands for democracy, more or less successful countries, more or less successful economies. And the EU, he despises the EU probably even more than he despises and ridicules NATO. And when he really let down a new Iron Curtain fall somewhere to the west of Russia, would he let it fall between Russia and the Ukraine, or between the Ukraine and Western countries? So yeah. My answer is an obvious one. Yeah. This will be complicated. To express sympathy for this, yeah, that's a completely different matter. It's also a cheap way of expressing sympathy. I say you will belong to us. Well, eventually we talk about 2040 or something. I don't know. I remember Romani Prodi, former EU Commission president, said the chances of the Ukraine to be once a member of the EU is about as good as the chances of New Zealand. I found this an insult, both to Ukraine and New Zealand, because we share a lot of things with New Zealand, particularly values and interests. The geopolitical situation is a bit complicated, I agree. No, it will take a while, but we have to now be pragmatic enough to create mechanisms that brings the Ukraine, once this is over. I mean, we cannot start thinking of a EU membership of the EU whilst Lemberg is Lviv is bombarded, Kharkiv is annihilated, and Kiev maybe occupied, and Odessa taken, and bad things happen. Then we face a humanitarian crisis. But let's devise mechanism to make this our associated status a good one, a helpful one that we can really develop and helps the Ukraine prosper and restabilize. I mean, this is now a country in war, and its cities are bombarded and shelled, and probably worse to come.
So, as a final question, and hopefully briefly, we've not really talked about the nuclear signaling from Vladimir Putin, and there have been exercises. There's been rhetoric. He's put his deterrence forces on alert, and is certainly puffing up the threat of a nuclear response. One of our viewers writes, are countries sitting on the sidelines of this Ukraine war because they are afraid of Russia's possible nuclear actions?
Sure. The whole thing, brings me back to Germany, Greater Switzerland, the horrors of the war. The Second War is still something that people here talk a lot about. In families where the elders are still around. My parents come from Silesia. They are no longer around, but my in-laws are still around. They talk often about the war, and they see no. We don't want to do this. We have been there before. Don't do this again. So it resonates strongly with an elderly cohort, particularly in the country. And I understand this completely. I understand this completely, and it shows the ruthlessness of Vladimir Putin to openly threaten a nuclear attack. This has been, I find it outrageous, and it really makes me ask, or make me think about his mental state. This is not just a cold-blooded calculation of cost and benefits. If you threaten your neighbors with, you may be history tomorrow. My friend, don't ever think about supporting the Ukraine. This is something else here.
Yeah. Well, Klaus, I really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today. This has been an incredibly informative conversation. I look forward to speaking with you again in the not too distant future, because undoubtedly the war in Ukraine is going to be occupying a lot of our attention. But as a foreign policy junkie, you are also looking at what's going on in other parts of the world. And so we would love to have you back to continue the discussion. But this has been terrific. So huge thanks to you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Steve, for having me. It's great pleasure to be with you and your colleagues.
Thank you, and stay well. And above all, gute Besserung to you and your family.
Thank you.